Welcome back. Tonight, I want to tell you about a mistake so quiet, so well disguised as devotion, that most people practicing this law for years never once noticed they're making it. Doesn't look like doubt. It doesn't look like giving up. In fact, it looks like the very opposite, like discipline, like commitment, like someone finally taking their desires seriously enough to work for it. And that's exactly what makes it so dangerous. It wears the costume of faith while quietly doing the work of fear. I want you to sit with a question for a moment before I say anything else. Have you ever noticed that the harder you try to hold an imaginal scene in place, the more it seems to slip away from you? Have you ever felt a kind of exhaustion after you have to practice rather than peace? Have you ever caught yourself gripping a feeling of fulfillment so tightly that your jaw actually tenses while you're imagining it? If any of that sounds familiar, stay with me tonight because what I'm about to describe may be the exact reason your desire has been circling just out of reach.
There's a difference almost nobody names clearly between faith and force.
They can look identical from the outside. Both involve repetition. Both involve intensity. Both involve someone deeply committed to a desired outcome, unwilling to let it go. But one of them opens the door to what you want. The other one, quietly and without announcing itself, slams it shut. Tonight we're going to find the exact line where one, the other. I'm going to show you how to recognize the moment you cross it. Because most people cross it without ever knowing they have. The mistake nobody warned you about. Every teaching about the law of assumption spends considerable time explaining what to do. Assume the feeling of the wish fulfilled. Persist. Remain faithful to the state. But almost none of them spend enough time on what happens when persistence itself becomes the problem. When faithfulness curdles into something else entirely, something that looks the same from the outside but functions in the opposite direction underneath. Here is the uncomfortable truth worth sitting with tonight. The very qualities that make someone a devoted, serious student of this law. Discipline, repetition, refusal to give up, are the exact same qualities that, misapplied, produce force instead of faith. There is no clear warning sign posted at the boundary between the two. No alarm sounds. You simply, gradually, without noticing, start pushing where you were once simply standing. And the moment you start pushing, something changes in the entire mechanism. Something that determines whether your desire moves toward you or quietly moves away. Neville spoke about this distinction more than people often realize, though it's easy to admit the more frequently quoted passages about persistence and repetition. He understood that persistence without ease isn't persistence at all. It's strain wearing persistence as clothing. And strain, however well-intentioned, however sincerely undertaken, tells the deeper mind something entirely different than faith does. It tells the deeper mind, this isn't safe yet. This isn't settled yet. I am still afraid this won't. And the deeper mind, hearing that message loud and clear beneath all the effortful repetition, responds to the fear, not to the words layered top of it. What faith actually feels like. Before we can recognize force, we need to be honest about what genuine faith actually feels like in the body, because most people have never been shown this clearly. And without a clear reference point, it's remarkably easy to mistake one state for the other. Genuine faith, the kind Neville actually taught, has a specific physical signature. It's quiet. It doesn't require constant reinforcement. It can be set down and picked back up without anxiety about whether it's slipping away in the meantime. There's an ease to it, almost a lightness, similar to the way you hold a fact you're not even slightly worried about. Your own name, the city you live in, the fact that water is wet. You don't defend these facts. You don't repeat them anxiously to yourself throughout the day to keep them true. They simply are. And your relationship to them is calm precisely because there's no contest involved at all. This is what a genuinely assumed state feels like once it's actually settled.
Not electric excitement, not gripping determination.
A kind of unremarkable, almost boring certainty. The same certainty you feel about your own address, held without strain. Because nothing about it requires ongoing effort to remain true.
Now here's the question worth asking honestly,
Right now, about your own current practice. Does your nightly imaginal scene feel like that?
or does it feel like something you have to work at,
Defend, hold on to with visible effort, repeat with increasing urgency because some part of you suspects that if you let go for even a moment, it will disappear.
If it's the second description, you may already be standing exactly
At the boundary we're about to explore. The moment it turns.
there is a specific identifiable moment where faith quietly becomes force.
And once you can see it clearly, you'll likely recognize it immediately in your own practice. Perhaps with a small jolt of recognition.
It happens the instant your relationship to the desired outcome shifts from this.
Is already true. This must become true. Notice how subtle that shift actually is in language, and yet how completely different the two positions are underneath.
The first rests in a settled assumption. The second stands in urgent need.
The first has already crossed the gap. The second is still straining to reach across it, no matter how many times it repeats the words of fulfillment.
This shift often happens gradually, almost invisibly, over the course of days or weeks of practice,
Rather than in one dramatic moment.
It typically begins with genuine faith. A person enters the imaginal
With real ease, feels the fulfillment authentically, and drifts naturally towards sleep.
But as days pass, without visible outer confirmation,
A quiet anxiety starts to creep in beneath the practice.
the nightly scene, which once felt like resting in something already true,
Starts to feel like an assignment that must be completed correctly, or the outcome will fail to arrive. The feeling being cultivated shifts from relief to striving.
and somewhere in that shift, without any clear announcement, faith has become force.
What makes this so genuinely difficult to catch? The person experiencing this shift is often in that very moment more convinced than ever that they're doing everything right.
They're practicing more diligently, more frequently, with more apparent seriousness than before.
From the outside, often from the inside too, looks like devotion deepening.
It's actually devotion curdling into desperation.
Disguised by the fact that desperation, when it's directed at something you genuinely want, can feel remarkably similar to commitment.
Why force repels what it's reaching for? This is the part worth understanding at a genuinely mechanical level,
Because it explains why so many sincere, hardworking practitioners of this law find their desired outcome staying stubbornly distant despite months or years of visible effort.
force operates from an underlying assumption of absence.
However disguised the surface language might be.
To force something is, by definition, to act as though it isn't naturally thriving on its own, as though without your continuous, effortful intervention, simply won't happen.
This underlying assumption, held beneath the words of the practice,
Is precisely the assumption that ends up shaping the outer world, because the deeper mind responds to the state actually being held, not to the vocabulary layered on top of it.
this produces a genuinely strange and frustrating result. The more someone forces an imaginal act, gripping it tightly,
Repeating it with escalating urgency, monitoring for progress with mounting anxiety, the more they're actually reinforcing the underlying assumption of absence that force always carries with it.
They believe they're strengthening their assumption of fulfillment.
What they're actually strengthening underneath the surface is the assumption that fulfillment requires this much desperate effort to secure, which is itself a quiet confession that it isn't already genuinely theirs. Think of trying to fall asleep by forcing yourself. The harder you try, the more elusive sleep becomes, because sleep, by its very nature, arrives only in the absence of effort. Trying is itself the obstacle. The desired states. This teaching points toward operate the same way. They arrive through settled assumption, not through effortful pursuit. And the moment pursuit enters the practice, it doesn't accelerate the outcome. It actively works against it, the same way straining against sleep only ever produces more wakefulness. The suspicious comfort of struggle. Here's something worth sitting with honestly, because it explains why so many people, once caught in this pattern, find it genuinely difficult to let go of even after recognizing it intellectually. Struggle, strangely enough, can become its own kind of comfort. If you've been taught, consciously or not, that worthwhile things require considerable struggle to achieve, then a practice that feels effortless can actually trigger suspicion rather than relief. Some part of the mind, trained by years of a very different cultural message, quietly distrusts ease. It whispers,
If this were really working, wouldn't it feel harder than this? Wouldn't I need to be doing more?
this is worth naming directly, because it's often the actual reason people slip from faith into force in the first place. Not because they misunderstood the technique, but because genuine ease, when it arrives, feels unfamiliar and slightly untrustworthy to a mind conditioned by years of believing that value must be earned through visible effort. So they added effort back in unconsciously as a kind of reassurance to themselves that they're taking it seriously enough. And in doing so, they quietly convert a genuinely working state into a struggling one, believing the whole time that the added effort is helping rather than harming the process. Recognizing this pattern in yourself, if it's present, doesn't require self-criticism. It's simply worth naming plainly. Ease is not evidence that you're doing it wrong. Ease is frequently evidence that you're finally doing it right. And the discomfort that arises around that ease says more about old, inherited beliefs about effort than it says about whether the practice is actually functioning. An extended example, the two versions of waiting. Let me walk through a full example, because this distinction becomes far easier to recognize once applied to something specific rather than left as an abstract description. Imagine someone who has been practicing an imaginal scene nightly around a desired career change. In the first version of this story, each night they enter the scene with genuine, settled ease. They feel the specific relief of the matter being resolved. Let the feeling settle for a few minutes and drift naturally. Sleep. During the day, they go about their ordinary business without checking constantly for signs, without rehearsing anxious scenarios, without needing daily reassurance that the practice is working. If a week passes without visible change, they notice this calmly, without alarm, and simply continue the same unhurried nightly practice. In the second version of this same story, the outward actions look remarkably similar.
The same nightly scene, roughly the same duration, the same general content, but the underlying experience
Entirely different. Each night, the person grips the scene tightly, repeating phrases with mounting intensity, sometimes for considerably longer than necessary, as though extra duration alone will force the outcome to arrive sooner. During the day, they check obsessively for confirmation, feel a spike of anxiety whenever a week passes without visible movement, and
will often add
Imaginal sessions during the day out of a growing, unspoken fear that the nightly practice alone isn't sufficient.
the visible technique on paper is nearly identical in both versions. The underlying state could not be more different. The first version rests in an assumption already settled.
The second version is straining, moment to moment, against an assumption of absence that
Never actually left. No matter how many additional sessions get added to compensate for the discomfort of that underlying absence. Very often the second version,
not the first, that produces the frustrating, drawn-out results people eventually attribute to the law
simply not working for them, when the law was working precisely as described the entire time,
faithfully reflecting back the state
that was actually being held underneath the effort.
the question that reveals the truth. Because these two states can be so difficult to distinguish from the inside,
Especially once force has become a habitual pattern, it helps to have a single honest question you can return to, one specific enough to cut through the confusion reliably.
ask yourself directly,
If I never checked for progress again, if I never looked for a single sign of confirmation from this point forward, could I still hold this state with genuine ease tonight? Not gritted teeth endurance.
genuine, settled ease, the way you'd hold the fact of your own name.
If the honest answer is yes, you are very likely practicing faith. Whatever the outward intensity of your technique looks like from the outside.
If the honest answer is no,
If the practice depends on the hope of eventual confirmation in order to feel bearable, you have very likely crossed at some point from faith into force, and the practice has quietly become something closer to bargaining than to genuine assumption.
this question is worth returning to periodically, not as a source of anxious self-monitoring,
But as an honest, occasional check-in. The goal isn't to interrogate yourself nightly before every practice.
it's simply to notice every so often which side of the line you're actually standing on.
Because the answer tends to shift over time, sometimes without your conscious awareness.
And catching the shift early is considerably easier than
Untangling months of accumulated strain later.
How to return from force to faith.
if you recognize honestly that you've drifted into force at some point along the way.
The path back isn't more effort applied in a different direction. It's a genuine release followed by a much smaller, much gentler re-entry into the practice.
Begin by setting the specific desire aside entirely for a few days. Not permanently, but as a deliberate pause.
This isn't giving up. Breaking the pattern of anxious, effortful grasping that's been reinforcing the very absence you're trying to resolve.
During this pause, resist the urge to secretly keep checking or mentally rehearsing the outcome.
Let the desire, the way you let an overworked muscle rest before returning to exercise.
When you return to the practice, return with considerably less intensity than before, not more. Choose a smaller, quieter version of the imaginal scene. A few seconds of genuinely felt detail,
Rather than an elaborate, extended narrative constructed with visible effort.
enter it once. Feel it as fully and gently as you can.
And then let it go completely. Without repeating it anxiously or extending it out of fear that once isn't enough.
This will likely feel uncomfortable at first, precisely because
The old pattern of force has been quietly reassuring you that more effort equals more security. Trust the discomfort as a sign of genuine change rather than a sign of failure.
over time, as the gentler practice continues,
The underlying sense of urgency tends to soften, and something closer to genuine, settled faith gradually takes its place, not through more effort, but through consistently less.
what this reveals about desire itself. There's a deeper truth hiding inside this entire distinction,
One worth sitting with as we move toward closing tonight. The intensity of your effort was never actually the measure of how much you wanted something.
It only ever felt that way because our culture has quietly trained most of us to equate visible struggle with seriousness of intent. But consider, the things you already genuinely possess in your life don't require effort to maintain your belief in them.
You don't strain to believe you have a name. You don't grip anxiously at the fact that you live where you live. The absence of effort in these cases isn't evidence of lack of care. It's evidence settled possession. And this is precisely the state Neville was describing all along. Not passionate, effortful pursuit of something distant, but the quiet, unremarkable certainty of something already genuinely held.
This means the entire relationship between effort and desire that most people carry into this practice
Gets reversed by a proper understanding of it.
You were never supposed to prove how much you wanted something through the intensity of your striving.
You were supposed to demonstrate that you already had it through the calm, settled ease of no longer needing to strive at all.
So here is what I want to leave you with tonight.
Somewhere in your own practice, quietly and without announcement, faith may have become force.
Not through any lack of sincerity on your part, but through a very human, very understandable confusion between effort and devotion. The mistake was never a lack of commitment.
If anything, it came from too much of the wrong kind, applied in the wrong direction, mistaking grip.
Faith strained for persistence.
Tonight, before you enter whatever imaginal practice you're currently working with,
pause and ask the question honestly. Am I resting here? Or am I pushing? If you're pushing, don't push harder to compensate.
set it down. Return smaller, gentler, quieter than before. Let the state feel, once again, like something you already calmly possess, rather than something you're straining across a distance to reach. The hidden mistake was never in wanting too much. It was in part that what's genuinely yours was never something you needed to fight for in the first place. It was only ever something you needed to quietly, calmly assume.
This has been the Neville Archive. I'll see you in the next one.